Next up, we have James Calabaza. He's director of the Indigenous Lands Program at Trees, Water, and People. James engages and works with U.S. tribal nations in the American Southwest on efforts centered around community-based, tribal-led stewardship projects that create economic and environmental development opportunities. In his role, James provides much needed insight and experience on working with tribal governments that uphold traditional ethics of governance and leadership, while also respecting tribal sovereignty. His deep-rooted experiences and cultural values strengthen TWP's approach in building honest, working relationships with tribes and promoting cross-cultural values of large landscape conservation. James is currently a first-year student in the Masters in Environmental Management program at Western Colorado University, where he plans to enhance his knowledge and skills to tackle socio-environmental challenges and issues.
Can everyone hear me good? All right, just want to do a sound check. Thank you, Lauren. Sorry. I want to open up my talk first with a quick, formal introduction in my native language of Karis. Just paying respect to the first indigenous and stewards of this land, but also leading into how important language is regarding land management stewardship through an indigenous framework and lens. Amerawa hopa ko at the sent ma ko trawich. Turik akiumish kun ko such at sin turi at the new up eshoma so kumich ko sayan. Tirikiti tusk asumish ti at the hook zahke ko oti ko ha o in zaichetik. The tunirak osa mehuni suhtek ha o it's aikchek ko tzitstik. But ish kruni se emitran el at the tiri yahni kuhni rawa. Naya matsa sutru kutsi ets ari nyukum sutru en tutsatsi tsina tsituritus ku yos kutsetas ramitikiti han tuke tu ramitsi ti kuik ashti ha o hat kutsaicha tse elturi ets tsinyo peshom ets dani americanani. That's a formal greeting and introduction in my native language of Karis. Karis was one of the dialects or languages spoken in New Mexico. I'm from Santo Domingo Pueblo, one of the 19 pueblos in the state of New Mexico. I'm really thankful and privileged to be here with you all tonight. I had to drive 4 hours from Longmont to make it, and talk a little bit about the indigenous perspectives to land management, connection, and stewardship. As mentioned, I wanted to start off with why language is important. And language, especially for indigenous communities, is deeply embedded with how natural resources, land management, and stewardship values and practices are taking upon, their own ways of methods. It's deeply rooted and grounded within our creation stories, our ceremonies, prayers, blessings, and everyday activities. We live in an era now where climate change is affecting not only our lands, but starting to threaten cultural lifeways. Because of how deeply language is connected to land and to the natural world of things, we're seeing that threat starting to come more and more prominent each time climate change is affecting our communities. And we all know climate change, we hear about the bad stuff, and sometimes it leads to good stuff, such as more funding coming through from the federal and state governments. But for the most vulnerable communities, globally, which includes indigenous communities here in the United States, they're starting to really build resilience around how they can take up measures and opportunities to protect with what little they have left, with their language, their lands, cultural resources, etc. I grew up on a small farm in north central New Mexico on the reservation of Santo Domingo Pueblo. During that time frame, that was the early years of really understanding and getting grounded what land and environmental stewardship meant to me. We grew traditional crops such as corn, chilies, melons, you name it. My grandpa has tried everything. But it was within that time frame where I really learned about respect and responsibility when it comes to working and coexisting with the land. And my community has always, worked in parallel with in terms of coexistence with the land since time immemorial. Basing it off reciprocity and humility, and how we're able to be thankful for what we get from it, but give back in regards to what we have taken. And in today's age, and climate change affecting our work or our livelihoods, I would say, is that we're starting to become more active. When I say we, I guess I'm speaking on behalf of Indigenous people. Um, we are starting to take a stronger position and role in regards to land management practices, being part of the discussions where policies being, discussed, and how to bring forth environmental justice into our work. Those values that I learned, as a youth growing up in my community have led to the work I am doing professionally right now. As mentioned, I work for a Colorado-based nonprofit called Trees, Water, and People. We're based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. We have been in operations for 25 years now, and specifically work with indigenous communities across the Americas. And within this work, we focus heavily a lot on post-fire restoration, watershed restoration. For those researchers in the audience, I know those kind of overlap a little bit. We do a lot on capacity building. We do focus on gender equity and inclusion. So really listening to Quincy's talk about women and their role in land management hits hard for me, because I come from a very patriarchal society where women don't have the same, opportunities and privileges as men do. So thank you so much for those poems and the words. Through my work, I've been privileged to, create and cultivate relationships with tribes, and really elevate their perspectives on what's wrong, what's not working, especially in this, again, era of climate change becoming more prominent in our lives. The one key principle that our organization has really been involved with is that fire component, and specifically post-fire. But learning through the process of, really listening, and I like to say, like, using these more than I have ever in my life, is that tribes really bring a wealth of knowledge to conservation and into land management practices. I was at a site visit 2 weeks ago in the Jemez Mounds, hosted by the U.S. Forest Service, and there was a huge tribal representation there, giving them the opportunity to really speak upon, like, how they used fire in past contexts. So this, being there, really listening to the words and the wisdom that tribes carry, since time immemorial, of how their ancestors used to, use fire as a tool to reduce future catastrophic fires from these ecosystems. They talked about how good fire is a form of medicine to the land, and that how it provides good positive outcomes, such as, protects biodiversity, recreates, new organic matter, but also helps wildlife habitat, through that process. So it was really beneficial to hear how these tribes are starting to revitalize their knowledge around fire adaptive practices, because since the dawn of fire suppression in the US, it's unfortunate that a lot of those practices have been lost or, unutilized because of suppression, policy here in the United States. Within my efforts as a program director at Trees, Water, and People, my main focus is really to elevate traditional ecological knowledge and, starting to mesh it in with Western science. Looking at the perspective more through a social sciences lens of how can those two coexist together. As a community, we're starting to really bring in this idea of environmental justice into our community spaces. But it's the science and the knowledge piece that I think needs, a little bit of work. So my work within the organization is focused heavily within the realms of how do we elevate the traditional ecological knowledge and combining it with Western science. And that's really how it led me to Western Colorado University. I was at a conference at Northern Arizona University about a year ago, sitting there in the audience waiting for a well-respected presenter to talk a little bit about, one of his studies he was doing. But well, before he got into his presentation, he opened up, um, with the curveball, saying that Western science hasn't been providing the outputs that we've been hoping for, through all this research and all the studies taking place. And this is a subjective, opinion from one individual talking from what he's experienced, unlike what science has, shown to him. But the room, went crickets. No one didn't have anything to say. It kind of kept everyone there thinking. And in that moment is when, it sparked. It was one of the sparking moments for me to be like, how can I play a role where traditional ecological knowledge can come in to support, some of the solutions to fight climate change. And it was within that audience, that's the audience that I was, part of, that I was like, I should go into graduate school. And thankfully, that's where I met Dr. Jonathan Coop. He talked to me about the Master's in Environmental Management program, and here I am now as a first-year student, first-generation college graduate within my family, looking to continue elevating and enhancing my skills around environmental management, policy, and promoting environmental justice. One of my first assignments, and I see Dr. Kate Clark in the audience, for my MEMS program was reading Braiding Sweetgrass. And for those of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend you reading it, or checking it out, or renting it on the audiobook, because the author, Robin Walt Kimmerer, speaks really highly and fluidly about the importance of traditional ecological knowledge and the role it plays in science and conservation. She focuses on two key themes: reciprocity and humility, things that I learned as a youth growing up in my community. So it's really great to see and hear and read about how indigenous communities play a very big role in regards to land management and conservation, because through their knowledge and through their practices of coexistence, it's going to be one of the main driving forces for us to move forward in this era of climate change. Moving forward, you know, my work with Trees, Water, and People, and my current studies within the MEM program is really, again, looking to elevate those voices, the knowledge systems, bringing those two together, but also bringing communities together. In my community in Santo Domingo Pueblo, we have a saying, and in Caris we say, "Ti nya omitra sutros te ho pa mi ho no ta sutro." Basically meaning that in order to get through this, effect of climate change and issues around land management or stewardship, it takes the community. It takes all of us to play a role in it. And I know this Gunnison Valley community is one of those communities that I'm very optimistic about, being a catalyst in making things move forward. Just from my time, being here, this is my third time here in Gunnison, already loving it, enjoy, talking to people. But I see this community being a catalyst towards moving things forward in a positive way. We're always talking about what are some of the solutions or answers that we can come up with to fight climate change. For me, those two answers are definitely inclusion of tribal peoples and their knowledge into practices, but also coming together as a community, because climate change affects all of us. It affects our public lands, it affects our resources, even those resources that are in an intangible way, such as language, such as stories. Those are what really bring us together. So in closing, I just like to say that I have high hopes that with the Gunnison Valley community and other communities across the country and globally, that we can learn and benefit so much from the indigenous and tribal communities in the role they're going to play towards fighting climate change. Thank you.